Good evening and welcome to the Equality Garden Club meeting. Excuse me. Those without papers, I'd like to give you a heads up. If you don't have paper or pencil, I'm going to make an announcement which might be useful to some of you. Right? I know a number of people, I myself included, have had earlier problems with getting COVID vaccines scheduling, and I wanted to tell people that the vaccines are now being administered.
Ben, we cannot hear you.
Okay. Am I on now?
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but we did have some kind of a glitch and it did mute you for about, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds. So if you could rewind a little bit.
All right, we'll start again. I love technology, right? A shovel is so much easier to work with. Hello, guys, everybody here. Just enjoy yourselves. Welcome to our meeting. All right. I was just saying that there's some good information out for certain people who have been having trouble getting their COVID vaccine, right? Excuse me. You're blocking me out. Thank you. Excuse me. And what I wanted to know is how is it that they are available in the city of Wilton Manors for those seniors age 65 and over, and you need to make a phone call. That number is 954-390-21101. And that phone line is going to be opening up tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. All right, that's Thursday, February the 18th at 11 o'clock. I'm going to repeat this at the end of the meeting if you didn't have it, if you want to get that number again. So don't worry about it, it'll come back. At any rate, tonight's agenda is going to be very simple. We start with me bugging you here for a little while, and then you're blocking. I've lost my notes because of that. Thank you. Right, we're having a hard time here tonight. Okay, Paul Durbin is going to be introducing tonight's speaker. That's going to be Paul. Excuse me, and the presentation is going to be made by Dr. Chad Husby, who comes from the Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. We encourage questions coming in from the audience and use the chat feature either on Facebook or on the Zoom. After that question and answer period, Paul will return to inform you of next month's programming, what we're expecting, and then I'll have a couple of closing remarks, and hopefully they'll all work well. Okay, let me get into today's remarks, and we'll proceed quickly. Oh yeah, I'm sure that last night, some of our members and some of our audience partook of Mardi Gras, a traditional night of quite a bit of revelry. Of course, that means that today is the first day of Lent, and that's when we repent our previous excesses. So regardless of how you celebrated this particular season, I hope that everyone is now comfortable and you're settled in for our presentation. Let's continue on. I have a couple of updates for our members and for the general population. In the last meeting, I announced where we were hoping to go and have a garden tour for our members. Well, that's not going to happen. It turns out we did a quick survey and it revealed that members are still quite apprehensive about the COVID-19 and they want to maintain their social distancing. We respect this. This is a good conscientious decision. And we're going to do something else instead. We are now looking into having a virtual garden tour in the near future. The details have not been worked out. This is only hoping. This is aspirational only at this point in time. But rest assured, I'm going to keep you appraised of how things are developing as they develop. One thing that we are going to have for sure is a rare and exotic plant auction. And that's going to be scheduled for the membership meeting of April the 21st. So on April the 21st, our regular membership meeting will be the rare and exotic plant auction. Right now, we're assembling a variety of unusual and interesting plants coming in from various sources, various vendors, various places, but we can always use more. Excuse me. If anyone has something unusual that they wish to share with other people, with the club, we are asking our members to contribute one of their offsprings of one of their prized possessions. And that would help make this a really successful event for all of us. It'll make it very interesting as well. I know some people have some really unusual plants, and you don't have to know the name. We'll figure that out. Anyway, besides the exotic plant auction, we're doing something else, which is having to do with native orchids. I'll give you a little background here. About 15 years ago, actually specifically in 2006, Wilton Manor was officially designated a community wildlife habitat. This is a program that enhances and restores wildlife habitat in urban and in suburban areas. Right? Interestingly, Wilton Manor was the 17th community in the entire country to receive that honor. So they were really pioneers on this matter. Ironically, some of the monies that we hope to raise with our exotic plant auction will be going towards reestablishing native orchids over here in Richardson Park, Wilton Manor, which happens to be also the home of our tropical plant fair, which is going to be going on in November. Through the Island Orchid City project, our club has signed a partnership documents with the Fort Lauderdale Orchid Society. And these documents are necessary for Wilton Manor to formally agree to accept our offer. This is just a technicality that we have to meet with them. Excuse me. Now, Richardson Park and Nature Preserve already contains over 100 varieties of native wildflowers and butterfly attracting trees and shrubs and different plants. And if you're attentive, you'll possibly see a couple of foxes running around. It's truly a wildlife preserve, and that's one of the reasons why no pets are allowed at any time. All right. EGC anticipates receiving the first of these indigenous orchid seedlings later this spring, at which time we will begin to actually attach them throughout Richardson Park. All right. And now that the glitches seem to be over, let's continue on, and we'll have Paul Durbin introduce tonight's speaker.
Okay. Dr. Chad Husby is the Chief Explorer at Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden. His main focus is on finding, cultivating, and propagating new plants to enhance horticultural and botanical collections. He focuses on plant groups with major unrealized potential, from conifers and ferns to plants with exceptional flowers, foliage, and unusual fruits. Chad also enjoys educating students and the public about plant exploration, horticulture, and botany. His scientific research ranges from plant ecophysiology and horticulture to conservation and systematics. And at any point during his presentation, you can type into chat any questions that you have, and also on Facebook, you can type in any questions you have. And with that, I will turn it over to Chad.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm delighted to be here with you all and to explore a couple of plant groups that we all probably are somewhat familiar with in South Florida, but I think hopefully tonight will open your eyes to some of how vast the potential of each of these is. So I'll start my screen here. All right, hopefully everyone can see that and hear me. So just to give some context here, at Fairchild, we have a wonderful tradition of new plant introductions going back to Dr. David Fairchild, for whom the garden is named, and who inspires us every day. And he was a great writer and had a lot of great, I enjoy discovering quotes he made, but which are often in our archives. And one of the interesting quotes I found was about just how he enjoyed the romance of planting trees from other lands. And the context of that was with regard to a fig that was named after him. So that was in his article called The Kerang Pandan Ficus of the Kampong. So he was very fond of figs among many other plants and introduced quite a few to cultivation. First, I want to mention some things that loosely bind Clusia and figs together. These are not naturally related groups in the botanical sense, but they are related ecologically and horticulturally. So that's why I'm combining them here. And both of these are often hemiepiphytic plants, meaning that an epiphyte is a plant like many orchids and bromeliads that live on other plants up in tree branches and whatnot. And they never touch the ground, whereas hemiepiphytes start out up high on a tree or other plants, and then they reach their roots down and can eventually grow into the ground and be attached to the ground. And sometimes, in the case of figs especially, sometimes even strangle their host and replace their host. So both figs and Clusia often live this way. They both have milky latex. Figs, famously, if you break a branch or cut a branch, you see all the milky sap that comes out, and it generally stays a whitish color in most figs. Whereas in Clusias, the sap always comes out white, but then once it's exposed to air, it oxidizes to different colors, which are sometimes useful for identification. It can be, for example, our native Clusia rosea, the autograph tree, oxidizes to a mustard yellow, others oxidize to red and orange and various other colors. Many of these members of both these groups are drought tolerant. They're good at tolerating difficult conditions without water for long periods of time. Many of them have waxy leaves. And they're often used as good hedge plants. In fact, the most common hedge plant that used to be in South Florida was Ficus benjamina, but then the Ficus whitefly came in a while ago and made those hedges very hard to maintain in good shape. And then what's largely replaced them is Clusia flava, which might be one of the most propagated plants in South Florida, just all one clone of Clusia hedges, because it basically has no problems. So now let's talk about Ficus first, because this is probably the most famous of those two genera. So there are about 800 to 900 species of figs in the world, and they're all in the tropics and subtropics. A few can handle some frost, but they're basically tropical plants. And they have an incredible range of habits. That's one of the things that really caught my attention with regard to figs when I moved down to South Florida about 20 years ago. Figs can be trees. All of the figs in the tropical America are either trees or shrubs. Some of them are banyans, meaning that they can be a tree that walks on its roots. The roots reach down and become very woody, and a tree can actually spread horizontally, which is a pretty neat trick. Shrubs, as I mentioned. Some are true epiphytes, which we'll talk about, a real favorite of mine, Ficus Deltoidea, later, which don't tend to reach down to the ground. They just live up on a tree or on a rock. As I mentioned, hemiepiphytes, that's one of the terms that's often used for figs is strangler, because sometimes they can strangle the host. But then we'll move into some things that are a little less familiar. Figs can be vines, or lianas, woody vines. All figs are a little bit woody, at least. Some can have stolons. We're familiar with stolons probably from strawberries, but amazingly enough, some figs can do that. It can be a ground cover that sprawls. They can have rhizomes even, and be almost herbaceous, meaning almost not very woody, which is pretty interesting. In terms of their physiology, they use the normal type of photosynthesis pathway that most land plants use, called C3. And although they're very good at still living without much water, their leaves are usually simple and alternate, all but a very few of them, or a few species in Asia have opposite leaves, which can confuse even botanists because we're all used to figs having alternate leaves. And figs never have compound leaves, they sometimes have lobed leaves. And in terms of their reproductive strategy, about 1/2 of figs are what's called monoecious, meaning they have functional male and female parts in the same plant, usually in the same fig structure. And about 1/2 are dioecious, meaning that each tree is either functionally male or female, and you need two to make viable seeds. And here in South Florida, and in many people's brief, often visits to the tropics, we think of the famous banyans, which is a very special and unique growth habit of figs, where they make these pillar-like woody roots that reach down to the ground, and the tree can cover several acres. And banyan is an Indian term that means market, and referring to the fact that you can have an entire market under a single tree, which is quite remarkable. And also, even though many trees are limited by how tall they can grow, figs have overcome that by being able to grow horizontally. And this is a particularly famous specimen in Florida. It's at the Edison Ford Estates in Fort Myers, and that's a statue of Thomas Edison down there. And according to tradition, this was given to Edison by Harvey Firestone of Firestone Tires. And at that time, back before the Second World War, there was a lot of interest in looking at figs as an alternative latex source for rubber, because the only other option was natural rubber. And David Fairchild and the U.S. Department of Agriculture were also very keen on looking at this. And so this what began as a small sapling from Firestone has now become a grand specimen. And in fact, they have to keep it in bounds because it could easily destroy Edison's laboratory and stuff, because it doesn't have its own limits. It just could keep growing laterally. And this is another example of a magnificent banyan. This is on Lord Howe Island. Has a version of Ficus macrophylla, the Moreton Bay fig, that becomes a banyan and can cover several acres. And this is one of our great, probably our #1 fig enthusiast in the country, David Dewsnap, down there for scale, who lives in Wisconsin and has hundreds of figs in his collection, but who's visited many of these wild areas. And this is a picture of another one of the most common banyans down here in Miami area, where Fairchild is at. It's my wife there for scale. This is Ficus Altissima, which also makes some of the famous kind of arches over roadways, like in Coral Gables and whatnot. So they've been here for many, many years. And this is a Ficus Altissima that grows on one corner of Fairchild. Its a common name is lofty fig, and this specimen is extremely lofty. But they often start life as very small little seedlings, like most plants that don't have big seeds. Figs have very tiny seeds, and they need light to germinate. So when you sow them on the surface. But they can be a bit of a hazard for structures. Some figs are called rock-splitting figs, for example. But this is a baby Ficus Altissima that's growing in the limestone wall at the visitor center at Fairchild. And so they can be something that would need to be kept under control, because they could certainly, they can grow without any soil, remarkably, and just live off what little bit of moisture they can get from reaching their roots into cracks. And eventually those roots get bigger and they can break apart concrete and break apart sidewalks, which many of us in various cities in South Florida are aware of, that these can cause sidewalk damage if they're planted too close. But not only Ficus Altissima is from Asia, and not only does that fig from very far away do this, but this is seedling of one of our 2 native figs. This is Ficus Aurea, which does the same thing and can grow in very inhospitable little rock surfaces or tree branches and become a strangler. And this is a mature specimen in the lowlands at Fairchild Garden of Ficus Aurea, one of our 2 native figs, both of which are potentially stranglers and hemiepiphytes, the other being Ficus citrifolia. And the other thing that people think of when they hear of figs is what you can find in the grocery store. This is a fruit of Ficus carica, the Mediterranean fig, which is the most famous of the edible figs by far, which is, as the name suggests, from the Mediterranean. And there have been hundreds of cultivars selected. This is one that ripens actually and stays green or yellow-green, which is good for fooling birds, which would otherwise like to hone in on the ones that ripen to darker colors and go eat them. But this fig, even though it's such a great food and whatnot, it kind of struggles in South Florida because it's both susceptible to nematodes and rust fungus that damages the foliage. They can live in fruit here, but they don't do as well here as they do, say, in North Florida or Georgia, or especially California, the dry Mediterranean climates. And that's just this time of year, they've lost their leaves, and this is a new emerging leaves on one of the Ficus carica we planted at Fairchild. Another example of the spectacular roots of figs that we sometimes think of, besides pure banyans, this is a specimen of what was once a fig named after David Fairchild. It was for a while called Ficus Fairchildiana, but it turns out to be Ficus, actually Ficus subcordata. And this is a specimen at Fairchild that was actually grown from seed from David Fairchild's famous expedition to the Spice Islands. He brought seed back from the Philippines for this one, and it's been here since 1940 or so. Another picture of this beautiful specimen that's really stood the test of time. We have a lot of very impressive figs at Fairchild. This is another one that's been in cultivation in South Florida for a very long time. It's Ficus racemosa. That's interesting because this one produces its figs, which are the technical term for them is syconia, which are structures that surround a whole bunch of tiny flowers. Figs have very interesting reproduction, which I'm not going to go into detail during the talk, but we can discuss it later if anyone's interested. They have a relationship with wasps that it's very, very specialized and complicated and fascinating. But this specimen, this species produces a whole bunch of figs on the trunk, but because, like most figs in cultivation outside their native habitats, it doesn't have its pollinator wasp with it, so these figs never ripen. They just fall to the ground hard. And even though if they did ripen, this is one species that would be quite tasty, but many figs aren't that tasty, but this is one that could potentially be so if we had the pollinator. But this is another variety, another form of Ficus racemosa growing in our fig plot that you can see it's a bit different, and it's earlier on in its fig production, so they're almost all green and they're a bit bigger. So, but it still counts as Ficus racemosa, and that's fascinating how much variation there can be within species. That's one of the things I like to explore. And this is a close-up of those Ficus racemosa fruits that are on these specialized little branches that it bears along the trunk. It's a phenomenon called cauliflory, or trunk flowering, or trunk fruiting. Other than the big trees, another type of fig that some of us are familiar with in South Florida, it's used fairly commonly in landscaping, is Ficus Pumala. It's a creeping fig that will grow up buildings. This is a specimen. You usually find the specimen only in the immature form, which makes a nice ivy-like effect covering the sides of buildings. But this was one I found up in Palm Beach area a while ago that's actually gone into its mature form. So if you don't continually prune it, it can eventually start growing away from whatever structure it's on a wall or whatnot, and actually start producing figs. Because they don't produce figs in the juvenile form, but the figs are actually quite large. They're a couple inches long. But once again, they don't ripen here because they don't have their pollinator. So that's a fig that's a vine, basically. It's like an ivy. The figs that do this are all from Asia. None of the figs in the Americas are vining or liana types. This is another one from tropical Asia. This is Ficus Velosa. That back when I was a graduate student, I used this to stump some of my botany professors because they couldn't guess what this was because it looked so much unlike a normal fig. And it's got hairs all over its leaves. It looks more like a gesneriid or something like that. But then again, it's got the milky latex. And it turns out with a little bit of extra water, this is one growing in Borneo, and it turns out that with a little extra water during our dry season, you can grow it quite well here in South Florida. This is one we're growing up the wall of the Science Village at Fairchild, where we installed some irrigation. And you can see those hairs there, which is not something we typically associate with figs. But there are all kinds of other wonderful vining figs that we're just beginning to explore in cultivation, most of which we don't have names for. This is one of them. I can see it's got a hairy stem and pretty new leaves. And this is growing outside our Whitman Conservatory up a limestone pillar with some extra water to keep it going. Many of these are from really wet rainforests, so they don't like to fight. They're not like Ficus Pumala that can grow up a fairly dry wall pretty effectively. These need some extra water, although this one might have better potential. This is for less irrigated structures. This is another one we don't know the identity of, but it's got much harder, thicker leaves, and it's from Taiwan, which is more seasonal climate like ours. So, and so far it seems to be a great climber for us. And so we'll have to test its limits and how much irrigation it can do without. But another fig that we're fairly familiar with here in South Florida is on the left there. That's the famous Green Island fig, which is used in a lot of malls and it's used in a lot of commercial plantings because it's very low growing and it does really well with pruning, just very occasional pruning. And it seems to be it's a variety of Ficus Microcarpa, which is a tree that we have in its giant form, is pretty common and actually gets a bit weedy because it seems to have its wasp here. So it comes up like Ficus Altissima, it comes up from seed. But then there are some other wonderful tiny versions of Ficus Microcarpa that we're actually experimenting with at Fairchild. This one on the right here is a version that they grow in Thailand that stays extremely compact and has much smaller leaves than the Green Island fig, and really beautiful shiny leaves too. And that's the one on the lower part of the screen there. It's got kind of fairly broadly oval leaves, and this is without any pruning. And then above it is one that was a new introduction from a couple years ago, back in 2017, on a trip we did to Thailand. And I saw in a market a little small-leafed version of a microcarpa-like fig that had cupped leaves. And it turns out it's a different form. And I bought all 4 of them for about $1 each, and that's we now have them, and we're working to get those out to the gardening public. This is the broadleaf, the kind of the oval leaf form here, and it's natural. It'll actually cascade on its own. It's a perfect no maintenance bonsai because it does. And this is creates kind of a swollen trunk naturally like this, and just the branches curve over and cascade down. And these are the little Syconia, the figs. And this is the cup leaf version, which has a similar growth habit, but has those nice, even smaller cupped leaves, especially when it's grown in higher light. They flatten out of more shade. And this one has a little more of an open, kind of flat-topped habit, less round. Some other interesting figs that do things in a small way. This is Ficus Manabiensis from Madagascar, in our Madagascar plot. It's called a rock-splitting fig because it will grow on rocks often and can gradually break off pieces of it with its roots. And another interesting small-leafed fig that's not a small fig, it's actually can become a sizable tree. It's one that's surprisingly little known because despite the fact that it's from our region, it grows in the Bahamas and other areas of the Caribbean. It's Ficus Americana. And most people, except maybe from the roots, you might guess it was a fig, but the foliage is so tiny and so dense that many people don't recognize this as being a fig. That's close up of the foliage, which doesn't remind most people of figs. They're little oval leaves with curled over, but then there are the figs. If you look closely during the right time of year, you'll see the figs. And we think this, they have some of these on Lincoln Road, Miami Beach, that look magnificent. So this is a plant that has a lot of potential in horticulture in South Florida, and it's not been realized. But in terms of other noteworthy foliage in figs, this is Ficus Pediolaris, another rock-splitting fig that good friend and colleague up at University of Washington just took this picture. It's Ficus, Dr. Jeff Benka. This is Ficus Pediolaris, which its new leaves have these wonderful, wonderful red veins. This is an African fig and looks very silvery. Some other noteworthy foliage that in figs is the Ficus Damaropsis, the dinner plate fig from New Guinea, which does very well here in South Florida. This is a specimen growing at Fairchild with these giant pleated leaves. It's got huge leaves, but it doesn't become a big tree, which is nice, and it doesn't have damaging roots either. So it's very well behaved. It's got reddish veins, especially on the young leaves, very corrugated. Leaves can get several feet long. It's massive leaves and really attractive fig. This is a specimen grown by the late John DeMott down in Homestead, really magnificent, showing its potential. And it produces these large structures that would become figs or ciconia. Mature ciconia are a fig if they were pollinated, but they aren't, so they tend to just go to this form of the overlapping modified leaves that then eventually fall, the whole thing falls off. But if it were pollinated, it would create a giant fig, which would be really neat. Its close relative, which for a long time was just called the lowland form of Ficus Damaropsis, but was clearly different, is a Ficus brucei. It was just described formally last year, I believe. And this is a specimen that's replanted after Hurricane Irma as a small plant at Fairchild, and it's become a magnificent specimen with even bigger leaves than Ficus Damaropsis. And it does produce also these giant, very unusual ciconia kind of pre-figs, and they also don't get pollinated. But these are a little more reddish, and the modified leaves have a little different appearance. But getting back to figs that people really don't recognize as figs unless they look closely are some things that are just beyond what most of us know. Like you know, a lot of plant people know about Ficus Damaropsis, but not many would guess that this is a fig, and it's actually a wonderful ground cover fig. And it just sprawls along the ground. It never becomes a big tree. It doesn't become a vine, and it makes a good combination even with orchids in the previous slide. And it's got another thing that's pretty uncommon in figs, which is really colorful leaf undersides. The underside's leaves are scarlet red. And then the new growth is quite nice, tends to be kind of purple red. And but if you look closely, you can see the little figs growing along the stem. So that's the clue that it's actually a fig. So this one we've been testing for several years in the landscape, and we've been getting it out to the nurseries too. It's just a fantastic performer, and it's going to have a great future in South Florida as a new ground cover. Another beautiful foliage color is this is Ficus Virens that in the lowlands at Fairchild that drops all its leaves for a short time and then puts out a beautiful flush of leaves that look almost like they have autumnal type colors, sort of reddish burgundy, and then they go back to their normal green. But you can almost get some seasonal effects with some of these figs because some of them do go deciduous, lose their leaves for a time and then grow new leaves. But another great ground cover that's a new introduction from our trips to Thailand is Ficus Squamosa, which is native to northern Thailand and other parts of Indochina. And this is from a few little cuttings from our sister garden, Nong Nuc Botanic Garden in Thailand. We've grown some great masses of this beautiful fig, which likes shade, and it doesn't get more than about 3 feet high. And very slowly, if you give it enough water, less slowly, will cover a large area. And this is in our rainforest here. And one of the interesting things about this fig that's kind of surprising is that it has opposite leaves. So you can see at each node here, the leaves are coming off at right angles. They're coming off correct 180 degrees from each other, and then the next pair comes off at a right angle. And so that's something that would confuse a lot of people about whether it's actually a fig, but it sure is. It makes figs. And but really, these are the figs here that it makes, which are very interesting and very bumpy and dark colored when they're mature. But this is a nursery specimen. But the really unusual thing about this, beyond its opposite leaves, which several other Asian fig species do have, is it has stolons, which are something we normally associate with other sorts of plants, like most famously strawberries. But these structures here are modified horizontal shoots, and these are the leaves. You can see that are much reduced, and they send them off under the leaf litter or hopping over boulders, because often these grow along streams along rivers in Thailand. And then the end, once it roots, will produce a new plant. So that's how, from a single specimen, you can get this slowly expanding colony. You don't have to worry about seeds volunteering, and because this one doesn't have its pollinator wasp, but it will gradually form a nice symmetrical colony. And so it's a wonderful plant, very easy to grow, easy to propagate, nice shiny leaves. One that's actually at an early stage in our evaluation is this one. We don't even know what species it is. This is one I actually have planted at home. I tested it full sun at home, and I had it on shade at Fairchild, and it's a little, at Fairchild, it's a little too shady for it. So we're going to put a specimen in more sun now that we've tested it. But this is one that actually produces rhizomes and has wonderful, beautiful lobed oak-like leaves, but upright stems. And you can see how beautiful the foliage is. But if you unpot it, you find something you never find in figs generally. It's these horizontal stems, and sometimes it even makes figs underground, although it will also make them above ground. And you can see they're all bleached white because they've never been exposed to the sun. And then it makes a very slowly expanding colony. But instead of having the above ground stolons like Ficus Squamosa, it's got these underground rhizomes. So it's once again, we're still trying to figure out if this is even described yet, this species. So I've been working with David Dusnap, see if we can tease it out. So far it's a mystery. But another fig, in terms of, we want to move into a little bit of the other aspect of figs beyond their interesting habits and their foliage and growth forms, is the food aspect, which is pretty exciting because we have some opportunities to go beyond the typical Mediterranean figs to some species that are more suited to our tropical climate. And this is a Ficus auriculata, formerly Ficus roxburghii, the Roxburgh fig, or as David Fairchild sometimes like to call it, the giant fig of the Himalayas, although it's not, it starts in the Himalayas, its range, but it goes all the way down through Borneo and deep into the tropical lowlands of Asia. And but once again, it doesn't become a giant tree like a lot of the banyan trees or whatnot. It becomes more of a kind of a spreading, rounded, shrubby tree. Like this is a specimen growing in Singapore at their municipal nursery there. A very old, big specimen, but it's a big, beautiful mound. And David Fairchild was really excited about this species and planted one at his home, the Kampong. But he had some interesting, he wrote a lot about it. And he mentioned here one of the things he enjoyed at the botanical garden in the Canary Islands was when he first saw this full-grown tree of this giant Himalayan fig, that time called Ficus roxburghii. And what he was most astonished by was the giant masses of figs that grow on its trunks. And this is that specimen in Singapore, just festooned with these giant, great big figs. They sometimes call it coconut figs. They're not quite that big. They're the size of maybe, maybe a couple ping pong balls or so each at most. And they grow on these interesting modified branches. And if they have their pollinator, they will ripen. Here in Singapore, they don't seem to have their pollinator, so they don't ripen. They just kind of eventually get a little darker colored and fall off while they're hard. They probably used to have their pollinator in Singapore because I think Singapore is within its range. But this is David Fairchild along with his giant fig that he planted at his home, the Kampong, up in Coconut Grove. And he was really, really interested in trying to make his ripen, because he tried all different tricks, like putting olive oil over the opening of the fig. And he would write letters to people about his different experiments. And he was frustrated that he never got them to figure out a trick that would get them to ripen without pollination. And so he relied on one of his great collectors, Dr. Joseph Rock, who did a lot of exploring in China, including the tropics of China. And this was from a wonderful article that David Fairchild wrote in the mid-40s. I just love the title, Are We Not Going to Do Anything About the Giant Fig of the Himalayas? So we're kind of delayed, but we're definitely doing something now. But he had asked Rock about what this actually tasted like, because he'd never had a chance to taste it himself. And he says, as he followed me in my study, his eyes caught me in David Fairchild's study, the rock site caught sight of his large Ficus roxburghii with its fruits. And he asked him if David Fairchild, if its fruits were any good. And of course, David Fairchild hadn't been able to eat them. But then Rock said, I've eaten many of them, great big things, 4 inches across and sweet as Smyrna figs, which are the Mediterranean figs, and borne on the special branches. Well, it turns out that there's a happy conclusion to at least beginning of a conclusion to this story that David Fairchild wanting to introduce. This is an edible fruit in South Florida. And it turns out that after Hurricane Andrew killed David Fairchild's original Roxburgh fig, original Ficus auriculata, Larry Shockman, the late great Larry Shockman, who was director of the Kampong for several decades, went on some expeditions overseas to replace some of the plants that were killed in Hurricane Andrew. And one of the plants he brought back from Bogor, Indonesia, in this case, was another Roxburgh fig, another Ficus auriculata. And unbeknownst to him, it turned out that this one actually is somehow it's a genetic variant that has fruits that will ripen without pollination, so we can actually eat them. And this is a propagation of the original Kampong tree, which is still at the Kampong, although it's actually a little smaller than the specimen because it's been growing in the shade for many years. But this is one now growing at Fairchild. We planted about 3 years ago. And it has beautiful new foliage when it grows, the new leaves. And it's already making glorious clusters of figs on the lower trunk. And as it gets bigger, the clusters of figs start appearing higher up on the branches, which is convenient because they don't go moldy as fast when they're not touching the ground. But these figs will actually ripen, these dark colored red ones. They eventually get soft and you can eat them, and they're quite tasty. They have very thick skin too, which is good for a tropical fig because it prevents diseases and pests from destroying them prematurely, as is often a problem with Mediterranean figs in hot, humid climates. And these are the beautiful figs ripening at Fairchild now. And that's what they look like inside. So, but these are all underdeveloped ovules that were never fertilized because this doesn't have any of the wasps going in there. But it tastes a bit like strawberries, which is interesting. It's hard to describe. It's definitely, although they're sweet, they don't taste at all like the Mediterranean fig. So it's a totally different fruit experience and quite wonderful. And supposedly there's another one in Hawaii, another version of this species that has figs that also ripen on its own that tastes like grape jelly. So that's our goal, is to get that introduced to South Florida too, hopefully in the near future, and have a couple of great new fruits, and thus fulfill one of David Fairchild's dreams, a few generations after he started and provided so much inspiration. Another neat Fairchild story that we've been able to follow up on is the Sycamore Fig, which is a fig originally from southern and central Africa, but it's been grown and eaten in North Africa and the Middle East for several thousand years, very highly prized. But once again, it doesn't ripen on its own without its pollinator. So in Egypt and in the Middle East, they figured out that if you cut the figs when they're very small manually, just put a little nick in them, they will ripen. They'll produce the stress hormone ethylene that makes peaches and bananas and whatnot ripen, and then they will ripen. And this is it's actually the sycamore that's mentioned in the Bible is not the platanus, the street tree that we're used to from northern places, but actually the sycamore fig. And but that was a very labor-intensive thing to do. But that was actually a profession in the ancient world, was a fig cutter. Basically, spend a lot of time cutting these figs, so they were ripen, and because they were so tasty, people thought they were worth the effort, even in a region where the regular Mediterranean figs do well. But the nice thing about Ficus sycamoris is that it does really well in South Florida. It has none of the problems of the Mediterranean fig. But, not many. David Fairchild tried to get the knack of nicking the figs at the right time, but never succeeded. And was frustrated by that. But now we have a clone. This is a picture of a baby one of a cultivar called Ficus Squamosa Balami, which arose in the northern Israel and what's today northern Israel and southern Lebanon about 400 AD, and seems to have arisen spontaneously and then was selected by people. But the fruits ripen spontaneously without pollination. And they will even produce in the pot figs, which the typical sycamore doesn't tend to do. And then they will ripen, like this is a ripe one here on the left, and they're quite mildly sweet and nice, but apparently when they produce the mature fruits, when the plant's been planted out, is when they really are tasty. And ours haven't matured yet, but I've heard that they have one of the original tree from which we got cuttings that's now in Naples Botanic Garden has produced fruit, and I hear they're really good. So we have something to really look forward to, and to another David Fairchild dream and a new fruit for South Florida. And this is one of the couple specimens we now have growing at Fairchild. It's getting to a nice size. This is in our fig plot, and it hasn't produced fruits yet, but it's become a beautiful open tree. And hopefully, maybe even this year, we'll have be able to share the experience of a brand new brand new ancient fruit to South Florida. And just as a little final story here on figs, the figs, are worth many, many talks on their own, as you can imagine, is one species that I find especially fascinating is Ficus Deltoidea. It's one of the few figs that's a true epiphyte, but it comes in all these natural variations. A good friend of mine in Singapore who introduced me to the interest of the species, Andrew Tay, made this collage of the different leaf forms in his collection. These are all leaves from plants that come from different areas around its native range, which is from extreme southern Thailand all the way to Borneo and the Philippines. And these are all natural variations. They aren't cultivars. And so they all count as the same species. And they turn out to do pretty well in South Florida. Our winters are they prefer a little warmer. They were suffered a bit this winter with so much continuous cold, but they're going to bounce back. And these are some of the plants we have at Fairchild here. This is a little display I put together. It's no longer there. We now moved it into another conservatory of different leaf forms. These are all from very tiny ones to bigger paddle-shaped leaves, all different natural versions of Ficus Deltoidea. And here's another little grouping of some of the different leaf forms we have. We've got probably in the range of 25 to 30 in total, different forms now. And this is a nice, cute little heart-shaped one. It's where we just had Valentine's Day. And they have these wonderful branching veins on many of the forms. That's very characteristic. It kind of gives them this deltoid leaf shape, which is where it gets its name, Ficus Deltoidea. Some of them even have dimpled leaves with depressions between the veins, like this one here, the Syconia, the figs, which don't produce viable seed because they don't have their pollinators in Florida. Some of them are different but this is one of the few figs also that has nice color underneath the leaves, often golden or orange, which is sometimes enhanced by different growing conditions. Oops. And can be quite vivid and quite an interesting fig. And sometimes actually quite a bit of variation in the figs too. This is some hairy kind of compressed figs. I'll show you a few more in a moment, but even some of the versions even have nice color on the new growth. And this is one that has red new leaves. And sometimes they'll change leaf form even on the same plant. A few varieties will have some leaves with pinnately branched veins, and then also on the same stem make little paddle-shaped leaves. So I'm sure someday people are going to study what controls the leaf shape in this. I'm sure we'll learn a lot about plant development perhaps from this plant. And there are a few man-made human-selected cultivars, like this is a beautiful golden form that gets a nice uniform gold color on the new growth when it's grown in high light. And these are some of the fig variations in different shapes and colors in Ficus Deltoidea. Some of the figs and they vary in size a lot too. So now let's move on from figs, from a little introduction to the diversity of figs, to a perhaps less familiar genus, Clusia, which is has less diversity of form, but a lot of other interesting things going for it. But it's got about half as many species, about 300 to 400 species, but it's only found in the tropical America, whereas figs are found all over the tropics of the world, both in America and Asia and Africa. Clusia is just in our hemisphere, and they're trees, shrubs, or hemiepiphytes. And there aren't any vines or really true ground cover types. And they do sometimes sort of strangle, but not really that aggressively. They don't tend to kind of put the type of woody grip on plants that figs sometimes do. But one of their claims to fame, which is what first got my attention when I was studying physiology, is that they can switch photosynthesis systems, depending on whether they're growing up in a tree branch where water is really lacking. They can use what's called CAM photosynthesis, which is the type of photosynthesis cacti use that allows them to only open the pores on their leaves at night and store the carbon at night, and then close the little pores, stomata, during the day, and just use the light to convert the stored carbon to sugar. So it's a way of conserving water when it's a little less efficient if there's plenty of water. So what the Clusia have been able to do is when if their roots eventually reach the ground, not all Clusia can do this, but many can, then they switch back to C3. So they're one of the elite group of plants that can actually switch their photosynthesis system, which has made them an object of great research interest for plant physiologists for many years. Their leaves are all simple and opposite. So the Clusia are all opposite for sure, as are all the plants in their family, Clusiaceae. And then they reproduce. They're actually completely dioecious. They have separate male and female plants, no combination. So you need, with one rare exception, you need a male and a female tree to get viable seeds. But what we're most familiar with in Clusia are the Ubiquitous Clusia, which have become ubiquitous. They used to be Clusia hedges in South Florida. This is one that's actually at the lowlands at Fairchild. It took some time to figure out what species was used in the hedges down here for sure, because it was hard to find flowering specimens. It's a species that doesn't flower often, and hedging it prevents it from flowering. But it turns out that there are some free-grown specimens. This hedge has gotten quite large. It's not flowering yet, though. So it turns out it's Clusia flava, which is from Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America. So it's adapted to our region really well, and it grows really well from cuttings, and it's kind of indestructible. So super drought tolerant, doesn't really have any pest issues. So it's become a great hedge plant, but you need to really keep hedging it or it can become really big tree. So that's the downside of this species. But one of the things that people don't necessarily realize about about Clusia, is that they have amazing flowers, many of their species. And like they often call them, some of them porcelain flower, because their flowers look like they're made of fine porcelain. And this is a female flower. These are the stigmas in the center here. And as I mentioned, many times Clusias start life as hemi-epiphytes, like in figs. And this is our one native species in South Florida, Clusia rosea. And this is a seedling of it, which you find quite commonly in palms and other trees around South Florida, because the birds eat their fruits and then deposit the seeds high in trees, and this or low. And this is the same thing that happens with figs. Usually they're dispersed by birds. And then they'll grow their roots into the crevices in the tree, and then eventually, or it can do it in a rock or a limestone wall, and eventually reach the ground. But Clusia rosea, our native Clusia, is unique among all the Clusia in that they're basically all females, and you only need females to reproduce, because they're able to produce viable seeds without pollination, a phenomenon called apomixis. So that's why that's the one you won't find any other Clusias coming up from seed in South Florida except our native one, because you don't get the male and females in proximity except under very rare circumstances of the exotic ones. But they can sometimes grow on rocks. This is one growing on a rocky hillside in Colombia with these big roots coming down. So it's basically solid rock below it, and it's growing as a hemiepiphyte like many figs do. This is a giant specimen of Clusia rosea in the lowlands at Fairchild, and you can see it can produce really big roots. It can become a massive tree, but it looks a lot like a fig with these big roots, and sometimes people mistake them for figs because of that, the older specimens. You can see it can make these tall aerial roots, which are great for that hemiepiphytic habit that they share with a lot of the strangler figs. But one interesting thing is that the flowers of male and female Clusias of the same species can often be very different. This is a female flower of Clusia lanceolata, which is a great species from Brazil. It was introduced by the USDA back in the 90s and is grown in some nurseries in South Florida. But that's a female, and then that's a male. So these are the stamens in here. And you can see those look like most botanists would think if they saw such different flowers that they were looking at different species. And with figs, the flowers can be a little confusing in that way. I'm sorry, with Clusia, the flowers can be really confusing in that way because they can be so different from in males and females. And in fact, they've done some genetic studies just to make sure that some of the plants that have fairly similar foliage, they weren't confusing, one species with another, because the male and females are so different that they weren't thinking that something was a male or a female of a certain species when it's actually a different species. So, but it's that the question is that difficult in some cases. But even the buds on Clusias can be very pretty, and some species are much more free flowering than others. Like some are very dramatic and they hang down like that. And the flowers can range very widely in terms of their colors. This is a beautiful red flowered one that was much used by the great Brazilian landscape architect Roberto Burle Marx, who introduced it to Hawaii. And then we brought it back from Hawaii to South Florida, where it grows beautifully. Still don't know what species it is. There's controversy on that, but they often produce this interesting little oil, very sticky resin on their flowers, which is actually favored by some of the oil bees that pollinate orchids. So our orchid biologist, Dr. Jason Downing, has encouraged me to plant more Clusias, which I didn't need that much more encouragement, but he says that they would help some of the bees that pollinate the orchids. So it's nice when plants can do sort of a double function like that. And this is that Clusia from Burle Marx with the big red flowers. And then this is Clusium Minor, which is a species that has a lot of potential in South Florida, a female flower, producing a fruit down here. This is a Clusia from Colombia that we saw in the mountains years ago, very beautiful one. This is a Clusia from Trinidad, which has great contrast in its flowers. And then if they do develop viable fruit, like this is our native Clusia rosea, which you can generally identify by its really big, wavy, paddle-like leaves. And if it's making fruit, you know it's rosea down here, and unless it's some exotic species that you have both male and female close together. But this is what the fruits look like, and then they eventually get reddish and will split open, and the seeds will be inside. And some of the fruits can get a little color to them. And some Clusias can actually have a little bit of color on the new foliage. This is one from Brazil that's been growing at Fairchild for many years. It came in from the Amazonian border of Brazil back in the 60s, and it has new leaves that come out red and then turn green. That's the original down in the lowlands at Fairchild, and we've been propagating it and getting it into wider cultivation. Still don't know whether this is a male or female because it hasn't flowered yet. And then there are even some interesting variations of our native Clusia rosea. This is one that we collected years ago in Jamaica that actually has red new leaves, but otherwise looks identical to our own Clusia rosea. But the native versions of Clusia rosea, the new leaves are kind of this yellow lime green, no touch of red. So it's interesting, subtle differences within species sometimes from one place to another. And this was the Clusia that really got me into Clusias. This is a photo way back when, from 2005, when I was a graduate student still and exploring the collections at Fairchild. And this was, I love symmetry in plants and things that have nice geometric shapes. And when I saw this with these nice diamond-shaped leaves and beautiful symmetrical branching, I was really, I had my tripod and I even took my picture next to it. So that was kind of how it all got started. And then I studied physiology and learned that they were interesting physiologically. So it's all been a love affair with Clusia since then. So some of the other interesting foliage of new Clusias we're experimenting with. This is one that has really nice, very roundish leaves. It's one with another one that we don't know what species it is, hasn't flowered yet, that was from California gardens, that teaching collections in universities, that has kind of rounded diamond-shaped leaves. This is another one that may be another red-flowered species, Clusia hilariana from Brazil, that has these beautiful, almost perfectly oval leaves. And this is one with also beautiful, really geometric oval leaves from Colombia, we saw there. And this is another one we saw in a garden in Hawaii that we're working on growing. And some Clusia can have really, really big leaves. This is Clusia Grandiflora that was given to us by a researcher at the Smithsonian. It's from the Guyanas, and you can see from my hand there for scale, this produces big leaves that can be over a foot long. And even though it's called grandifolia, it also is known to have exceptionally large flowers that are over 6 inches across and look like this beautiful white porcelain. So hasn't flowered in yet, and it's a very slow grower. So we're hoping to get it to flower before too long at Fairchild, and we'll follow us on social media. I post lots of new plant pictures on Instagram and Twitter and whatnot. So if you want to find out about new things flowering and doing interesting things in the garden, that's where you can hear it first. And these are the big leaves. They have a little bit of a red edge, as you can see at the top here. And this is that Clusia Grandiflora. And this is a nice paddle-shaped leaf species from Guatemala that we got from the Prague Botanic Garden. It's growing well at Fairchild. And sometimes you can get some interesting variation within species in Clusia as well. The plant on the right is a version of Clusia fluminensis that's commonly grown in many nurseries in South Florida and sometimes used in landscapes. It's a small, very small leaf Clusia, and one of the smallest that I've ever seen. And it looks like, I think this was introduced by Burley Marx back several decades ago at the Longwood Gardens calls it Clusia species Pedra Azul. That was the name that Burley Marx gave, which is a locality in Brazil in Espírito Santo state. So that's probably where it came from. but it has very small leaves compared to normal Clusia fluminensis at the left here, which we got this, which is much harder to find in cultivation, ironically. We got this specimen from the Huntington Botanic Gardens in California. You can see how much bigger its leaves are, the normal, more typical form, and which we're now evaluating for horticulture in South Florida. But this small leaf Clusia goes by all sorts of inaccurate names. You'll see it called Clusia rosea nana often, which is a totally wrong name. It's not Clusia rosea at all. And sometimes Clusia guttifera, which is also what the hedge Clusia is sometimes called, which is not it's not actually a real name for anything. It just seems to have been a name that somebody did combining the old family name for the Clusias and guttiferae, which is now usually we call it Clusiaceae, and combined it with the genus because nobody knew what it was. So it's none of those. It's a version of Clusia fluminensis, call it Pedra Azul. And here's a side-by-side comparison. These are the leaves of that Pedra Azul plant. You can see it's much smaller than the leaves of the more typical form from other parts of Brazil. And there are so many amazing Clusias still out there to be discovered and tested in horticulture, both here and in their countries of origin. This is one I've been dreaming about to evaluate someday. I'm encouraging some of my Brazilian colleagues to try this in cultivation. It's Clusia obdeltifolia, a great geometric name for the leaves with these kind of compressed oval leaves, and it grows in really harsh areas in Bahia, Brazil, with rocky, very hot, and quite dry. And it makes this wonderful, compact, almost reminds us in South Florida of like a sea grape. And so this is a photo from Flickr of the species, where it's interesting what you can discover just by searching for images on some of the right websites. And so that's a little window into the world of Clusia, which were even earlier in our explorations of them in figs and ficus. But I'd like to bring it back with a couple kind of the big, larger themes with a couple of quotes from David Fairchild here, nice passages that where he mentioned, that even though he did a lot of great things and was a quite famous man in his time and did a lot of famous writings and whatnot, but it was really the trees that were what meant the most to him. And that's what those of us who enjoy exploring and introducing new plants and evaluating them and sharing them find to be the thing that's the most satisfying legacy, because it goes beyond our individual fates. And so, he loved the trees, first of all, which was one of the things that made him such an inspiring figure to so many, not only through his writings, but personally, was that he was very humble and he loved all the, just to share the joy of plants and not his own glory. And then another great thing he said, that our gardens are places in which to wonder, and wondering to put new forces to work, forces that will change the world. So the appreciation for plants and their incredible diversity that we can explore through gardens can have a much bigger role. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd be delighted to entertain any questions that have come up.
Thank you, Chad. I have a couple of questions for you. Hang on, I'm pulling them up. The first one is ficus generally considered invasive?
That's a very good question. We have a couple of native ficus, so those by definition usually aren't considered invasive, although sometimes things like cattails can be invasive. Invasive generally refers to plants that are doing something we as humans don't want them to do, kind of like wheat. And but most figs don't, people have cultivated probably anywhere from a couple hundred species over the years, if not more, in South Florida. And there's only about 5 that actually reproduce by seed in South Florida. And most of them seem to never get their pollinator here. And some, Ficus is such a huge genus. We have everything from some ficus need, kind of extra watering and whatnot and TLC here. Others are very tough. So it's really, figs, most figs are super safe. It's only a few that few of the exotics that, like Ficus Altissima, which can, get around a little more than we'd like. Ficus Microcarpa, Ficus Religiosa, the Bodhi tree from India, the tree that the Buddha is reputed to have received his enlightenment under, has been grown in South Florida for many years and now reproduces by seed. Somehow its pollinator seems to have gotten here. So there are a handful that do that, but generally, we see it more of as an issue of, figs maybe getting on people's roofs on occasion. If they don't remove them, they can cause a problem around a wall, or they aren't usually a big problem invading natural areas yet, as far as I can tell, because the ones that do behave like our, that are kind of getting around, or usually behave kind of like our native figs. Is you can see them growing side by side sometimes and growing in the same rock crevice in a wall.
Okay, the next question is, I know you answered some of this, but is the fruit edible?
Yeah, in general, it's kind of interesting because most figs don't seem to taste that good, even if they ripen. But I don't know of any fig that's toxic, so probably every fig, if it's ripe, is probably technically edible in terms of, you can eat it and you won't have ill effects. But only certain figs seem to really be tasty to humans, at least of the ones, and only certain of those will produce, will ripen their fruits outside their native habitat, which makes them a good fruit tree. So, they're like, for example, I have tried, our native figs, and they're not that tasty, but I've tried, for example, Ficus religiosa, which will ripen in South Florida, and it's actually quite tasty. It's got kind of almost like a raisiny flavor. So that was kind of a surprise. You kind of never know. It's like, it's worth smelling every orchid because, some of them have wonderful fragrance and you won't know if you don't try it. It's probably similar with figs. We had a really interesting kind of daring fig eating experience in South Thailand back in 2018, our last overseas trip. And we went to South Thailand, where they do something that I was not aware of, where they actually eat certain species of green fig. We're not sure which species it is. We have one plant that we think might be that in the collection. But they would give us these unripe figs and then this hot sauce to dip them in or to mix with the figs. And somehow the figs are very bitter and full of latex. I would never try a green fig under normal circumstances, but our host there was very encouraging that we should try the local cuisine. And, we're very like to not turn up a new plant eating experience. So we did try them. They were really bitter. And, but if you combine them with this really hot sauce, it's sort of like the heat, the spiciness somehow cancels out the bitterness and they became more palatable. So even the green fig, I'm still here. So I guess it wasn't toxic.
Okay. Next question is, what insect usually pollinates the figs?
All figs are pollinated by these little, very tiny wasps that are usually specific to each species of fig. There are a few examples of wasps that seem to be able to do more than, pollinate more than one species. And, we don't know if there may be some of the figs that have started to reproduce by seed in certain areas like South Florida or Southern California, if another wasp is somehow figuring out how to get in, how to pollinate, or some other insect. But there's still much to be learned. If you want a really wonderful documentary that goes into all the details of the relationships between a fig and its wasp, there's a documentary about Ficus Sycamorus called The Queen of Trees. That's a really beautiful story of the life cycle of a fig. So I highly recommend that. And you learn about the wasp and everything else that depends on figs. Figs are really important ecologically. A lot of birds and primates depend on their fruits as well.
Okay, the next question is, are there any other Mediterranean ficus besides Ficus carica?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, they are growing in cultivation, obviously, as Ficus Sycamoris for a long time. But yeah, offhand, I can't think of another fig that like grows in Southern Europe or around the Middle East, except for Ficus carica. There may be. Yeah, I would have to do some more research to find out. That was a really good question.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, have you done any extra pollinating for F. auriculata Larry to set mature fruit? Is it certain that this cultivar doesn't need the specific wasp to fruit properly? I wonder if these wasps could have a presence at Fairchild or at the Campon.
Yeah, it doesn't. I haven't seen any evidence that the ficus, that the Schachmann ficus are being pollinated. Which is the same with the Sycamore Fig, the Balami cultivar. That they don't, because if you look inside, when you eat those Schachmann figs, they don't crunch. You don't get the crunchy seeds, so it doesn't. And I've not seen any evidence of wasps in them. The figs that are getting pollinated by wasps, you usually see either the wasps or their remains if you look really closely inside the fig. And no, we aren't doing any extra pollinating. I mean, it's hand pollination of figs would be technically extremely difficult because you need to get inside the figs and somehow get the pollen from male flowers to female flowers. It's something you need to have like a microscopic insect drone to do it or something. Well, so no, so it's just spontaneous ripening, and some figs just seem to do it. I mean, it's something like with the Sycamore fig that they would ripen by nicking the figs. There are other things you can trigger, the better. I mean, and it's the same thing with the Mediterranean figs. They don't require pollination to ripen. But if you want seeds, they need to be pollinated. But the Mediterranean, you can grow a Mediterranean fig anywhere and grow it from a cutting, in your house, as a patio plant, and there's a conservatory plant up in Canada, and where it's never seen a wasp, and it will produce fruit, a Mediterranean fig, and you don't have to do anything to make it ripen because it's the physiological switch that bypasses ripening is flipped somehow.
Okay, the next question is, how do you see these, whoops, 1 second. How do you see these many new Ficus and Clusia becoming available in horticulture? Well,
that's another great question. That's a big part of our mission at Fairchild, is to get plants out to the wider world. And we've been offering some of these in our plant sales at Fairchild recently, and they're certainly getting to a number of our local nurseries. And fortunately, most Clusia and Ficus are very easy from cuttings, with rare exceptions. And interestingly enough, the Schachmann selection of Ficus auriculata is more challenging to propagate from cuttings, but we've got some tricks we're working on. And but most of them are pretty easy, and the ones that we evaluate and that are doing best at the garden, we've been introducing through the plant sales and also just sharing them with local nurseries and other gardeners. And we want to certainly get as many of these that are good performers, and of course we also make sure that we don't want any that are might have potential for invasiveness or whatnot. But fortunately, these two groups are generally quite safe because of their biology.
Okay, the next question is, do you have a specific feeding program for F. auriculata? Some that I have planted are showing micronutrient deficiencies.
We aren't doing anything very fancy. They do sometimes, we've seen some micronutrient deficiencies too, but I mean, the more fertilizer, the better for most figs. They seem to just have an almost insatiable capacity for fertilizer. One thing that, about Ficus auriculata is it does lose all its leaves, so the leaves tend to get naturally kind of bad looking around actually this time of year, and then they suddenly drop them all and then they grow a new group. So it's probably a good idea to give them some good fertilizer while they're, before they go completely leafless and reflush, to And that's a good time to test whether what you're doing is correcting whatever micronutrient deficiencies they have. Although there are some auriculatas that have been growing for a long time in Florida, in South Florida, down in Miami, some older specimens that seem to be just fine. So there may be some, may just be specific sites cause them to be a little deficient, or it's just maybe just some genetic individuals are just a little better adapted to our limestone soils than others. But yeah, we're still got a lot to learn in that area.
Okay, the next question is, are Ficus and Clusia plant families related?
Not really. No, I mean, they're related in that they're eudicots. They're not, they're more closely related than either is related to, say, corn, but I just included them together here just because they're kind of associated in horticulture, like palms and cycads tend to be associated because they have similar uses in the landscape, and also figs and clusias tend to have similar ecology. The way they grow is hemiepiphytes. They're very kind of tough, resilient, waxy leaves, that kind of thing, easy from cutting. So they tend to, so it's just kind of, it's a horticultural pairing, not a botanical pairing.
Okay, the next question is, are there any known techniques to reliably force ripening on figs?
Well, there's the fig cutting, the nicking of the figs. It's the ancient technique, but you need to get the timing right. I know in Ficus Sycamorus, and I think I did try it a little bit in another New Caledonian fig that was supposed to taste good that we have. It's reported in its native area. They even make pies out of it, but I tried nicking them at different stages and never got it to work, just like David Fairchild never got it to work on his Ficus Sycamoris. Probably, yeah, it's probably something that requires some fairly focused attention to get the timing and technique right. It's probably why it was a profession back in the ancient world. But there may be ways, you could maybe expose figs to ethylene in other ways, but that might be a little tricky. Maybe bagging, figs with a plastic bag. I've never tried that, but it might. But then you risk rotting them or something to capture kind of ethylene or increase the carbon dioxide around them. But yeah, it just seems more an issue of trying to select the cultivars or the natural varieties, depending on situation, that have this ability to ripen on their own.
Okay. The next question is, are there any Clusia breeders? I'm obsessed with Clusia flowers and would love a more significant and longer show.
Yeah, Clusia, I'm not aware of anyone breeding or crossing Clusias yet. That would be a great, Clusia is kind of early in its horticultural life. I'd say much earlier than it deserves, but it's kind of exciting because it's one of those areas where you may think that, this far, in the beginning of the 21st century, everything's been done, but a lot in the horticultural realm has not been done and not been explored. But, we're still even trying to figure out which species are the most reliable flowering plant, but they don't seem to, I haven't seen ones that really keep their flowers for really long periods of time, but the flowers are pretty waxy, the petals, and it seems like one could potentially select for them to just hold on to their petals longer, and it'd be great to try hybridizing them and try selecting seedlings and whatnot. But I mean, it's a little bit more complicated because for many of these species we have that we're just evaluating, we only have a male or a female because we've only got one, and we don't know which even yet. So it's going to be a long-term project, and it's going to take a lot of enthusiasts and a lot of botanists and horticulturists to work together to make this happen. Tree breeding is a long-term project, but some Clusias are flower much more readily than others. Like a species that I think has really got great potential is a hedge plant. It's a much better hedge than Clusia flava is Clusia Minor, that species that really got me excited at first at Fairchild, with its diamond-shaped leaves. And that one will flower quite young and flower regularly from cuttings. And it branches much more densely on its own. It doesn't seem to get as woody as Clusia flava, so it seems much more suited to be a hedge, and you get to see flowers. And whereas Clusia flava, you'll never see a flower on a Clusia flava hedge unless you let it become enormous, which then it wouldn't even be a hedge. So yeah, it's early days. So dream and explore.
Okay. The next question is the biological mechanism behind flowering maturity well understood enough to develop a technique or chemical to induce early flowering for identification purposes?
I assume this is a Clusia question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, because flowers are not helpful in ficus because they're enclosed in the fig, the syconium, and you can't even really see them unless you dissect out and they actually use the whole structure for identification. So in Clusia, yeah, I haven't come across studies of control of flowering in Clusia. For one thing, it's probably too much of a long-term project for most graduate students and professors to do, but it would be a great project. I mean, we're actually at the stage of just figuring out which Clusia species might be the ones to use for such studies that flower more readily in the first place, that could be experimented on, things like Clusia Minor. There's some Clusias that just seem to, like this one species we have from Costa Rica, that the buds just seem to hang on forever and only reluctantly open. So there's all kinds of variations that would be great to study. But yeah, all the physiology work I know of with Clusia usually has to do with the CAM-C3 photosynthesis switching. So the flowers are wide open. So if anyone knows any promising young botanists who want a great project, Clusia would be a great thing to study, as long as they find a project they can finish in 3 years.
Okay, thank you, Chad. That's all the questions. A great program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Pleasure.
The next thing I want to talk to you about is the next presentation, which is going to be on Wednesday, March 17th at 7 o'clock. The speaker is going to be Rose Bichard-Putman, and she's with Broward County Naturescapes. Naturescapes is a vision for the community that starts in your own backyard. Naturescape is about creating Florida-friendly landscapes that conserve water, protect water quality, and create wildlife habitat. And we're very excited to have her come to speak to us. That's everything. Dan, do you have anything else?
Hello, there we go. Excuse me. No, I don't have anything to add to that. That was a very comprehensive thing about the figs. The only thing, a question in my mind, I didn't bring it to, I was wondering what kind of fig could fit in my backyard, because everything I saw was huge, but I thought that was just a little bit too amateurish, so I left that one alone. Anyway, before we leave, I want to make sure that anybody has a chance, if they want to get in touch about those vaccinations for COVID-19, that number to call is 954-390-2101. And the phone's open tomorrow at 11 in the morning. And that's for the city of Wilton Manors, and you have to be a senior, age 65 or older. But if you haven't had a chance to get an appointment, this is a great shot at it, and it's just around the corner. I'm not going to go into anything. Paul went and did a nice summary of what's going on with Naturescapes that's coming for next month. I think it's going to be a really interesting one. I encourage people to watch it because it's bringing nature into your backyard, and it dovetails wonderfully into our efforts to go and bring the Green Initiative, where we're stopping the use of pesticides. We're trying to encourage more and more natural selections of things. And also it brings in the question of the Island Orchid City project, where we're reintroducing native flowers. So there's all of a cycle, if you will. At any rate, I want you to stay safe and stay healthy, and I hope to see you really in real life soon. This meeting will now adjourn, and I want to say good night to all of you. Thank you very much.